Hello, and welcome to Wallace's Mysteries of Antiquity. Subscribe to the channel to join me in exploring the enigmas of our distant ancestors and try to come to tentative conclusions about them. Have you ever looked at the top of the Great Pyramid and noticed that one of the stones doesn't quite look like the others? I've known it was there for a long time. When I was looking at graffiti up there, I studied it pretty closely, actually. I'd made the poor assumption that it was simply a piece of basalt. The pyramid builders built a huge basalt paved area around the pyramid, and likely had several blocks of it that just weren't good enough for that, and I figured they just tossed it into the pyramid. After making a post on Reddit saying that I'd found the 1555 graffiti that Night Scarab mentioned the French saw, someone commented, quote, "What's up with that stone painted blue?" End quote. And oh boy, did that lead me down a rabbit hole. I even mentioned back then in the thread that I'd always assumed it was basalt. Guess that's what happens when you assume things. So my first question was, when did this happen? You can see my immediate thought was the color reminded me of Napoleon, but I also didn't think the paint looked that old. First, since many people have overlooked it before, let me first prove to you that it is in fact blue. Here it is with really good lighting from a drone, and from this angle it is extremely obviously painted blue. So I started looking backwards in time. Here are two older images of the top of the pyramid that I found. I had to show you this just to share some frustration, as well as make a point. Firstly, the frustration. This guy is literally laying on top of the stone that I want to see. How annoying is that? You can see some of it, though, but not enough to tell if it's a different color. However, in this image, the stone itself is quite visible right here, and I personally do not see any difference between it and the ones next to it. Any difference in shade can be attributed to the fact that the top of the stones and the platform as a whole isn't even remotely flat. But I'm fairly confident that any person looking at these old images would agree that the stone is not painted yet. Am I right? And that's a really, really big problem, because I lied to y'all. That's a color image that I desaturated. It's from 1993, and it very clearly shows that the stone is already painted. Here it is zoomed in, and you can see how big of a problem this is. You simply cannot tell what color this stone is in a black and white photograph. That severely limits our ability to determine how old it is, because we are required to either find clear documentation or use only color photography. Even in color photography, it can be hard to see depending on the weather conditions and the type of film used. It's clearly a different color here, but almost looks grayish. This is just what photos from the 90s looked like, desaturated. Of course, with modern tools, I can enhance the picture, but without stacking from a video, the color detail is just limited to what it is. I can just increase the contrast. Color photography is a relatively new thing, especially in places like the top of the pyramid, where the only real way to do so would to be bring a color camera up there or take a shot from an airplane or balloon. But even most early professional shots like these from Time magazine are in black and white. They're easier to print. For the 19th century, we need to go off of descriptions. Flinders Petrie does not mention a blue stone on top of the pyramid. However, I'm also not convinced he ever actually went up there. Almost all of his writings talk about measuring the base and interior. He actually doesn't even mention the summit in his 1883 The Pyramids and Temples of Giza. John Perring certainly did climb to the top, as this is an accurate depiction of it from this side. And I'm certain there is no reference to any painted stone on top of the pyramid at this time. Nor does he draw anything special to indicate anything different. Lack of evidence of paint is not evidence for lack of paint, but they recorded other strange things, so it seems unlikely to be there in 1837. Henry Salt drew the top of the pyramid in the 1820s, and you can tell from History for Granite's side-by-side comparison of what the top actually looks like from this perspective that he was too accurate to have not personally seen it. This big stone in the middle is the blue one, as you can see from the image on the right, and he does not draw it any differently. So I think we can safely assume that Salt made detailed notes while actually on top, and he did not notice any paint. In fact, no archaeologist, or anyone as far as I can tell, has ever mentioned it at any point in history in like an academic sense. So that's a big time gap now where all we have is black and white images. You might wonder what's the oldest photo that I could find of the summit in color. And, well, here's the thing. Just from being online, even if you're not into climbing, you have probably seen the view from the top of Everest, right? You can probably picture it fairly easily even. But let me ask you this. What's the summit look like? Seriously, can you picture the peak of the most famous mountain in the world? This is it if you're curious, but who would climb Everest and then share pictures of the ground? Hopefully that little thought experiment brings home the point that photos from a good vantage point are common, but photos of the spot itself are much rarer. Almost everyone who climbs to the top, either legally or illegally, take photos like these. They're much more spectacular. The only people who would climb all the way up there and then turn their camera down at the ground are nerds like us. The earliest photos of the top in color I could find dated to 1993. If you're going to tell me that you've seen color footage of the pyramids from World War II, seen it. That's colorized and enhanced footage for documentaries. This is what those actually look like. So 1993 is the earliest I could find, which sucks. That's a huge span of time. So we're going to have to investigate the color itself and try to narrow it down more. First, let's even confirm that it's paint. Fire and scorch marks was a very common interpretation. In fact, I think it was the most common first thought. I think every single person I asked mentioned it. And you can even see remains of a fire in this old photograph. But there are two problems with that. There are many obvious burn marks from fire all over the summit. But they all have two things in common. First, they are protected from the wind, in nooks and cracks. As an experienced outdoorsman who's gone through a dozen ferro rods, I'm confident it is not possible to sustain a fire on top of that stone. Fire requires a windbreak. Secondly, they're all basically brown and black. I work with a chemistry lab, so I just went to one of the chemists, particularly this one, and asked her, is there anything that'll just oxidize blue? I got a very clear no. Blue is a very rare color in nature. Most things oxidize brown. While some things will turn blue in specific circumstances, there is nothing you could burn that would produce a bluish stain. At least not without doing some advanced chemistry at the top or without killing yourself. For example, burning Prussian blue dye will produce smoke filled with hydrogen cyanide, better known as Zyklon B, which we know, thanks to places like Auschwitz, is horrifyingly effective at killing people, and I don't recall any news articles of people getting sick or dying at the summit of the pyramid. Let's get this out of the way too. While copper oxide does have a bluish tint, it's closer to a pale green naturally. The bright blue, you may know, is copper oxide reacted with sulfuric acid, which would require actually doing chemistry at the top to produce. I'm sure another painter might point out cobalt, but the bright blue color you may be familiar with is a very specific mix of aluminum cobalt oxide that is not just going to form naturally. The black powder on the right is what normal cobalt oxide looks like, and these are the simplest ways to make blue. Almost everything else naturally blue requires even more advanced chemistry, usually biochemistry. Let's look at the pattern. It's not just the top. The face that is exposed is also painted, but we see no indication of any paint on any of the neighboring blocks. This may actually tell us something, that it's not spray paint. To be clear, there is some bleeding onto nearby rocks on the arrows, but if this were spray paint, we'd get a much more diffuse bleeding pattern onto the nearby rocks from mist. These look like places where the painter simply accidentally hit the neighboring rock with a brush. By just looking at the quantity of the paint and coverage, I can be entirely sure that this is a fairly thick layer of paint applied with a brush. You can see where parts of the paint have faded over time, but also places where either stone has been chipped away or the paint itself has flaked. It looks more like the stone has chipped away. Okay, so I'll get back to some sciencey terms in a bit, but for now, you're just going to have to deal with some vibe-based archaeology, as a painter tells you what this looks like to me. I think it's a polymer-based house paint from the 1980s. Until the very late 1970s, most outdoor paint was lead-based. This was very robust and weatherproof, and was replaced with polymer paint in the USA in 1978 because, well, lead is really bad. It also does this over time. You can see chunks of it just flake away. The entire world used to be covered in this kind of paint. The left and right are images in the United States, and the center one is Pripyat inside the Soviet Union. The paint on the stone shows no evidence of this pattern of wear. This paint has faded a lot more like modern house paint, so that's what I believe it is. I think this entire paint job could have been done with about a pint, so it would not be difficult to bring it up there with a brush. As for the color, I had initially believed it to be Prussian blue, but after looking at it more closely, I think it's a dark indigo, which is a much cheaper color of paint. Lastly, the reason I think it's a polymer-based paint is because from certain angles, it seems to have a very strong specular reflection. I think the reason that this angle, for example, shows very little blue is because it's reflecting the sun at the camera. Lead-based paint is fairly matted, but polymer paint can be very shiny. So let's tentatively say that I believe this stone was painted sometime in the 1980s or very earliest the late 1970s. That cuts a huge amount of time off and eliminates a lot of possibilities. For example, it can have nothing to do with this wooden tower that Gil erected in the late 1800s, or the occasional trip the Egyptians took to the top just to turn it so that it would erode evenly. But I was still stuck, so I asked Reddit. If you hang out in the Ancient Egypt subreddit, you'll occasionally see me commenting on things. If I post a question there, like something like this, it usually means I've exhausted all my leads and am getting desperate. The thread happened to blow up and was on the front page of Reddit for a few days, but despite all that attention, including from Egyptologists and people who had bribed guards to climb up there, no one had any further leads. Someone suggested surveying, as it is a prominent block very close to the middle. I considered this for a while, but then rejected it. The stone is visible from above, but not really from the sides or below. It's nestled in between other stones, and if you're looking at it from the air, surely you'd want some better contrast than shiny blue paint. Red is pretty much the standard for that. I looked on YouTube, and the only video I found on it is from Land of Chem. And, well, like I said, I do a lot of chemistry, but I don't really debunk. So, he also seems to be of the opinion that this stone is actually just blue, and then compares it to other bluish stones that the ancients used. But I've already shown that this is not an ancient blue stone, it's just limestone that's been painted recently. So I started getting even more desperate. This seems like the type of information that either doesn't exist, or you just have to randomly stumble across sometime doing something else. And I just haven't randomly stumbled across this thing yet. So I need to just ask other people that do this. I've made some contacts doing this, so I guess it's time to use the ace up my sleeve. So I sent messages to like a dozen people who all have collectively spent centuries just reading the most random stuff about the pyramids, hoping one of them had found this before. Huge thanks to everyone who responded. I'll only mention those with public personas, but most people had absolutely no idea. Most of them didn't even know the stone was there. Keith Hamilton didn't mention the stone in his Great Pyramids Layman Guide, but was aware of it. He actually made a suggestion that I hadn't considered before, that perhaps it wasn't purposefully painted at all, but actually a spill. But further evidence showed that to be unlikely, as it seems to be an even coat, where a spill would have big globs and it'd run down in an obvious, not level surface like that. History for Granite posted this image to celebrate 400,000 subscribers 3 years ago. In it, you can clearly see that it's not the entire stone that's covered. We can see that at least the faces against the other stones are not painted, and it is just regular limestone. Unfortunately, although he agrees with me that it's likely paint, he has not found anything new since either. I was able to get a slightly enhanced version, and you can see that only the top of the stone is painted. He was the first to confirm that this is just limestone 3 years ago. When I asked him for his source, at first I thought he sent me the wrong one, but he somehow managed to catch what's visible for like a fraction of a second in this guy's video. Channel friend Lawrence Van Vliet also did some digging on his own and found the same desert of information that I did, as did some friends I've met in random Egypt channels. But I've come to the conclusion that this information likely doesn't exist. So, if no one I know even has a clue about what this is, that would suggest that it was never officially sanctioned and is just an act of vandalism. But doesn't that seem strange? Graffiti is usually a name and a date, not just randomly painting a whole stone one color. There's no art here. There is a fairly prominent inscription on top of the same rock that I can't quite make out. I believe this is a last name or nickname, and it certainly starts with AB and ends in MAN, but I'm not sure about the rest. Googling what I've transcribed or similar variations brings up nothing. If any Arabic speaker could sound that out and let me know if it means something, I'd love to know. The K might be an R, there might be some different letters in there too. But perhaps someone painted the stone to preserve an inscription they made. But this doesn't really seem like normal behavior, so I was completely stumped. But you see the title. I thought of something. Something I don't think anybody else had because it came to me under very specific circumstances. In my last video, I told you I recently lost my wife and was taking a break from this. I've been coping with my guitar, my friends, but mostly I've been painting. I was painting our favorite campsite. I'll show you another video, it's not done yet. But anyway, I was thinking that I'd gather my supplies and actually go paint at the lake this weekend. And while I was thinking about that, I grabbed a tube of purple paint. I realized it was acrylic, not oil, so not useful for my painting. But since I was already thinking about going to the lake, and I know acrylic paint will stay, I thought about painting something permanently purple out there for her. Not a tree, those don't last very long. Stones are permanent. Then I remembered that before it all happened, I'd been asking people about a randomly painted stone. So that's my final hypothesis. The Great Pyramid was special to someone, and so was the dark blue color. The painter lost that someone, climbed the pyramid to paint the central stone at the very top for them. that's the only reason that seems to logically fit this strange vandalism. So my tentative conclusion for this video is that the blue stone in the summit of the Great Pyramid is an epitaph. Now, people lose loved ones all the time, and there are many types of love, so this isn't necessarily even a romantic gesture. This could be for a child, a parent, sibling, friend, pet, whatever. For all we know, it could be a fallen soldier, but the only people who ever knew probably never told anybody. Everyone I suggested this to considered it at least plausible. But this is an open question, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it in the comments. Why is this here, and why is it painted so weirdly? And does anybody know of any images that can solidify the time frame for this? Thank you for listening. Let me know your ideas and critiques, and subscribe if you wish to continue to join me in exploring the enigmas of our distant ancestors together.